Carlos Rivera, a first-generation Mexican-American student, struggles with isolation and subtle racism at a predominantly white university. When a racially charged incident involving a black student sparks campus-wide protests, Carlos is initially hopeful. However, he becomes disillusioned when he realizes many protest leaders, including his roommate, previously ignored him. As tensions rise, Carlos uncovers a shocking truth about the protest's origins, forcing him to choose between exposing the lie or staying silent. Carlos Rivera, a first-generation Mexican-American student, struggles with isolation and subtle racism at a predominantly white university. When a racially charged incident involving a black student sparks campus-wide protests, Carlos is initially hopeful. However, he becomes disillusioned when he realizes many protest leaders, including his roommate, previously ignored him. As tensions rise, Carlos uncovers a shocking truth about the protest's origins, forcing him to choose between exposing the lie or staying silent. Carlos Rivera, a first-generation Mexican-American student, struggles with isolation and subtle racism at a predominantly white university. When a racially charged incident involving a black student sparks campus-wide protests, Carlos is initially hopeful. However, he becomes disillusioned when he realizes many protest leaders, including his roommate, previously ignored him. As tensions rise, Carlos uncovers a shocking truth about the protest's origins, forcing him to choose between exposing the lie or staying silent. Carlos Rivera looked out at the vast golden wheat fields from the window of the old pickup truck, his heart filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. His new life was just beginning. After growing up in a predominantly Latino neighborhood in East Los Angeles, he had earned a scholarship to study at a university in the Midwest. This small town, Sandstone Hills, would be his new home for the next 4 years. Carlos had never lived in such a rural area, and the tranquility felt surreal. Back home, the city buzzed day and night with the hum of cars, the loud chatter of neighbors, and the occasional sirens in the distance. Here the silence was almost oppressive. There was nothing but the gentle sway of the wheat fields and the occasional distant bark of a dog. He had imagined what it might be like. He knew he would stand out here. There weren't many people of color in Sandstone Hills, an overwhelmingly white town with deep rural roots. But Carlos wasn't worried about that. He had grown up hearing stories from his grandparents about the challenges they had faced immigrating to America. In comparison, moving to a small town and studying was an opportunity. He was ready for it, or so he thought. His father's truck, a rusty relic from the early 90s, sputtered as it pulled up to the campus gates. Sandstone University was an old and prestigious institution, the kind with ivy-covered buildings and traditions that stretched back over a century. The campus sprawled across several acres, lined with oak trees that turned brilliant shades of red and gold during the fall. It was the complete opposite of the urban landscape he was used to, but the fresh air and open space seemed like a breath of freedom. As he got out of the truck, a few passing students glanced his way, their expressions unreadable. Were they just curious, or was there something else? Carlos tried to shake the thoughts away. "Don't start thinking like that," he muttered to himself. "You're here to study, make friends, and grow." He grabbed his duffel bag from the truck bed and started toward his dormitory. On the surface, everything seemed welcoming enough. The people smiled, the trees swayed in the autumn breeze, and the campus was alive with the chatter of students. But the sense of isolation was already creeping in. Inside his dorm room, Carlos met his roommate, Blake Stevens, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with sun-bleached hair that suggested he spent more time outdoors than in a library. Blake was from a farming family in Iowa, and though his accent was different from the Spanish-inflected tones Carlos was used to hearing, they got along initially. Blake was polite but reserved. He didn't invite Carlos to hang out with his group of friends, who often went to the local diner or attended fraternity parties. Carlos noticed that Blake's friends rarely acknowledged him when they passed by, and sometimes when Blake was talking to them, they would glance at Carlos, whispering things he couldn't quite hear. It was subtle, but the isolation was growing. That first night in his dorm room, Carlos stared at the ceiling, listening to Blake's soft snoring from across the room. The campus outside was eerily quiet, far different from the bustling neighborhood streets of East LA. He couldn't shake the thought that he was an outsider here. no matter how hard he tried to fit in. His parents had warned him that college would be challenging in more ways than just academics, but he hadn't expected to feel so alone. As the days went by, Carlos pushed those feelings aside and threw himself into his studies. He'd always been a hard worker, and he wasn't about to let feelings of isolation distract him from his goals. He had come here to prove something, not just to himself, but to his family, who had sacrificed so much to give him this opportunity. Carlos' first few weeks at the university were a whirlwind. Classes were challenging, but he found solace in the hours spent at the library, poring over books and assignments. He hadn't made many friends yet, though he had struck up a casual conversation with a few students in his study groups. One evening, Carlos joined a study group for his history class. The group consisted of 5 students, all of whom were white. At first, the meeting seemed normal. They exchanged ideas and worked on their assignment. But as the night went on, the conversation drifted from academics to more personal topics, like where they were from and what their backgrounds were. When it was Carlos' turn, he told them about growing up in East LA, about his family's Mexican heritage, and how hard his parents had worked to make sure he had a shot at a better life. "Oh, so you're like first generation or something?" one of the girls, Sarah, asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "But something else too. Pity?" "Yeah, first generation," Carlos replied, his smile faltering slightly. "That's cool," she said, though her tone was detached. Another student, Kevin, chimed in. "Man, that's crazy. I can't imagine growing up in a place like that. You must have had it rough. You know, with gangs and all that stuff." Carlos felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "It wasn't like that," he replied, his voice strained. "Yeah, there were challenges, but it's not all bad where I'm from." Kevin nodded quickly, perhaps realizing his mistake, but the damage was done. The rest of the conversation felt awkward, forced, and Carlos couldn't wait to leave. The small slights, the microaggressions, were things Carlos had been warned about, but experiencing them firsthand felt different. Growing up in East LA, he was used to his culture being part of the community around him. His neighbors, classmates, and even the store owners spoke Spanish. He never had to explain who he was or where he came from because everyone understood. Here, every interaction felt like a reminder that he was other, a foreigner in his own country. The subtle alienation Carlos felt started becoming harder to ignore. It wasn't outright hostility, at least not yet, but it was the kind of passive exclusion that gnawed at him. Blake's friends would organize study sessions without him. In group projects, his ideas were often ignored. At parties, people would laugh and joke, but whenever Carlos approached, the mood seemed to shift. One time, Carlos went to the cafeteria and sat down with Blake's group, trying to strike up a conversation. They responded with polite smiles, but the moment he left to grab a drink, their whispers and side glances told him everything. The message was clear: he didn't belong. As the semester wore on, the feelings of isolation began to fester. Carlos tried his best to focus on his studies, calling home often for support. His mother always told him to stay strong, reminding him how proud the family was. Still, the distance felt palpable. It wasn't just the miles separating them, it was the cultural and emotional distance that seemed to grow with every passing day. Then one night, it all came to a head. No. Carlos was walking back to his dorm after a late-night study session. The campus was quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the empty courtyard. As he passed by a group of trees, he heard it. Laughter, hushed voices, and then a word that made his blood run cold. "Spec!" He froze. For a second, he thought he might have misheard, but then it came again, louder this time. "Look at him, walking around like he belongs here." Carlos's heart raced. He couldn't see who was speaking, but the voices were close, too close. He turned, scanning the dark for the source of the whispers. He saw 3 figures standing under the trees, their faces obscured by the shadows. He didn't know what to do. Confront them? Run? He had never dealt with something like this before, not directly. Sure, he had heard racist comments growing up, but they had always been distant. Comments on TV, mutterings in public. But this was aimed directly at him. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and continued walking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the words followed him, slithering through the night like poison. Go back to where you came from. Betty's here on a free ride. The words stung, each one a reminder that no matter how hard he tried to fit in, there would always be people who saw him as different, as less. Carlos made it back to his dorm room, his pulse racing and his thoughts tangled. Blake was already asleep, snoring softly from the other side of the room. Carlos lay awake for hours, the insults replaying in his mind like a broken record. What had he done to deserve this? For the first time, he questioned his decision to come to Sandstone. Was it worth it? The scholarship? The degree? Did any of it matter if he had to constantly fight to prove his worth? The next day, Carlos tried to push the thoughts aside and go about his routine, but the weight of the previous night lingered. He found himself scanning the faces of students, wondering if they had been the ones who had called him those names. He started walking faster between classes, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact. The university, which had once seemed like a beacon of opportunity, now felt hostile and suffocating. Carlos didn't tell anyone about the incident that night. He didn't want to be seen as weak or worse, as a victim. But over the next few weeks, the tension on campus seemed to grow. He noticed more stares, more whispered comments. There were even a few instances where someone had scribbled racist slurs on bathroom stalls or left nasty notes on his desk in the lecture hall. It wasn't just him either. He heard rumors that other minority students were experiencing the same thing: snide comments, exclusion from social groups, and even some outright confrontations. But no one seemed to be doing anything about it. The administration turned a blind eye, and the majority of the student body remained silent. Carlos felt like he was drowning in a sea of indifference. The isolation was becoming unbearable, and for the first time, he seriously considered dropping out. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this. Maybe the dream of blending into a predominantly white university was just that, a dream. But before he could make any decisions, something unexpected happened. One morning, Carlos woke up to find the campus buzzing with activity. There had been an incident, a big one. A black student, James Wilkins, had been assaulted the night before by a group of students who had hurled racial slurs at him. The attackers had been arrested, but the damage was done. The news spread like wildfire, and the university was forced to confront the growing racial tensions on campus. For the first time since arriving at Sandstone University, Carlos saw real outrage. Students organized protests, demanding that the administration take action. There were calls for diversity training, for the creation of safe spaces, for a dialogue on race. At first, Carlos was relieved. Finally, people were talking about the issue. Finally, he wasn't alone. But as the protests grew larger, he began to notice something strange. The faces in the crowd, the ones holding the signs and chanting for justice, were overwhelmingly white. And not just any white students. Many of them were the same ones who had ignored him, or worse, been part of the whispers and stares. Carlos watched in disbelief as Blakey, his own roommate, stood at the front of the protest, holding a sign that read "End Racism Now." Blake had never mentioned the attack to Carlos. In fact, he had never once acknowledged the racism that Carlos had faced on campus. Yet here he was, at the forefront of a movement, as if he had been fighting this battle all along. Carlos couldn't believe it. Was Blake just trying to look good? Was this some kind of performance? The anger simmered inside Carlos, but he held his tongue. The protests stretched on for days, growing in intensity. Speeches were given on the quad, banners were hung across the main academic buildings, and the local media even came to cover the story. Sandstone University had suddenly become a battleground for racial justice, and Carlos found himself caught in the middle of it all. The issue that had been whispered about in dark corners and scribbled on bathroom stalls was now in the spotlight. But it didn't feel right to Carlos. Something was off. Carlos confronted Blake that night. He couldn't hold it in any longer. How can you stand out there with a sign pretending to care about racism when you've barely spoken to me for months? You and your friends ignore me, and now you're suddenly an activist? Blake looked taken aback, as if Carlos had slapped him. Whoa, man, I didn't know you felt that way. I'm just trying to help. This is a real issue. Carlos felt his anger rise. You didn't know? How could you not know? You've heard the things people say. You've seen how I've been treated, but you never once stood up for me. You never even asked if I was okay." Blake shifted uncomfortably. I, I didn't think it was my place. I didn't want to get involved. And now you do? Now that it's a public spectacle, you want to act like you care? Blake's face hardened. Look, I'm trying to do the right thing here. Just because I wasn't vocal before doesn't mean I don't care. Carlos shook his head in disbelief. You're just doing this because it's popular now, because everyone else is doing it. But where were you when it mattered? Blake had no response. Carlos didn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with anger and betrayal. Blake's indifference had stung, but what hurt even more was the hypocrisy. How many of these protesters truly cared? How many were just following the crowd? The next morning, Carlos's thoughts continued to swirl. Everywhere he went, students were talking about the protest, about racial justice, about what needed to change. But it all felt shallow, performative. The very people who had ignored him, who had made him feel invisible, were now acting like they were champions of equality. For the first time, Carlos considered leaving the university entirely. Maybe it wasn't worth staying in a place where he was only visible when it was convenient for others. Maybe he could transfer to a school where he felt like he truly belonged. As the weeks passed, the protests continued, but Carlos grew more and more disillusioned. It seemed like everyone was jumping on the bandwagon, students, faculty, even local politicians. But to him it felt hollow. The same people who had ignored the problem for so long were now acting like they were the heroes of the story. Then one day, Carlos received an anonymous note slipped under his dorm room door. It read, "Meet me at the old chapel tonight, midnight. I need to tell you the truth." Carlos didn't know what to make of it, but something about the note piqued his curiosity. That night, he made his way to the old abandoned chapel on the edge of campus. Inside, he found Sarah, the girl from his history study group. "What are you doing here?" Carlos asked, confused. No. Sarah looked nervous, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "I have to tell you something. Something you need to know." Carlos frowned. "What is it?" Sarah took a deep breath. "The whole protest, it's a setup." Carlos blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Blake, Kevin, and a few others. They planned it. They wanted to stir up a racial incident on campus to get attention. The attack on James, it was orchestrated. James was in on it. They thought if they made it seem like racism was a bigger problem than it really was, they could pressure the administration into making changes. Enough. Carlos felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. "You're saying they faked the attack?" Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "It was supposed to be harmless. Just a stunt to get people talking. But it spiraled out of control." Carlos stared at her in shock. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I didn't sign up for this," she whispered. "I didn't know it would go this far. And I thought, you deserve to know." Carlos walked out of the chapel that night, his mind spinning. Everything he thought he knew about the protest, about the people around him, was a lie. Carlos returned to his dorm room, replaying Sarah's confession over and over in his mind. He was angry, not just at Blake and Kevin for manipulating the situation, but at himself for not seeing the signs earlier. But what was worse, exposing them or letting the charade continue? The protests had gained traction. There were now campus-wide discussions, faculty members giving passionate speeches about diversity, and local news covering the struggle at Sandstone University. Even the university president, Dr. Graves, had announced an overhaul in school policies regarding race, inclusion, and equality. Students were being lauded for their bravery in standing up for justice. But it was all built on a lie. Carlos felt trapped. He didn't know whether to confront Blake again or go directly to the administration. What if no one believed him? What if Sarah's confession was her way of manipulating him too? Could it be that she was trying to sabotage the progress that had finally been made for minority students? Carlos's head buzzed with confusion. He couldn't sleep, replaying the memory of that night and wondering if it was all part of some elaborate game. Was the campus's newfound social consciousness something to celebrate? Or was it as artificial as the motives behind it? He needed more proof. The next morning, Carlos decided to approach James Wilkins. Maybe James had been roped into the protest too, without knowing the full story. Maybe Sarah had exaggerated. Maybe. But when he knocked on James's dorm room door, the answer was far more shocking than he could have imagined. James opened the door, his eyes slightly puffy and dark rings beneath them. Carlos noticed that James seemed on edge, as if he had been expecting trouble. "Carlos, right?" James asked, rubbing his face. "What's up, man?" Carlos hesitated for a moment, but then dove straight into the subject. "I need to ask you something important. About the attack. Was it real?" James flinched, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to accuse you of anything, but I heard from someone that the attack wasn't what it seemed. That maybe you were in on it? That it was staged." Carlos held his breath, hoping James would deny everything and prove Sarah wrong. But James's face paled. He didn't answer right away. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then James closed the door halfway, as if to prevent anyone from overhearing. "You should leave this alone, Carlos," he said, his voice dropping to a low, tense whisper. "What? Why?" "James, I need to know the truth." James sighed, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yeah, it was planned, but not like how you're thinking. We didn't think it would go this far, all right? Blake and Kevin came to me with the idea. They said it would be something simple, a little staged incident to get attention for the racial issues on campus. They said no one would get hurt. I didn't think it would spiral like this." Carlos stared at James, his mind racing. "So, you were part of this? You agreed to fake an attack?" James nodded reluctantly. "Look, man, I didn't want to, but the reality is, there's been stuff like this going on for a while, just quieter. Blake said this was the only way to get people to take it seriously. He was right in a way. Things have changed. People are finally talking about racism, and we got the administration to listen." Carlos couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But at what cost, James? You let them turn a real issue into a spectacle. And now, none of it's real." James shook his head, his voice rising in frustration. "The racism is real, Carlos. Just because this one incident was planned doesn't mean the problem isn't there. And if we're finally getting people to care, then maybe it was worth it." Carlos stepped back, his stomach churning. "I can't believe this. You betrayed everyone who trusted you." James leaned against the doorframe, his expression conflicted. "Maybe, but what are you going to do about it? If you expose this, you destroy everything we've built. The movement, the momentum. Is that what you want? To be the guy who ruined the chance for real change?" Carlos walked back to his dorm room, James' words echoing in his mind. What would happen if he exposed the truth? Would the entire campus turn on him? Would the administration sweep it under the rug? And if he stayed silent, could he live with himself, knowing that everything was built in a lie? For the next few days, Carlos wrestled with his conscience. He started noticing small things around campus. People of color, like him, who had finally started feeling empowered, walking with their heads held higher because they believed something was changing. The protests had given them a voice. Even though the initial incident had been orchestrated, the impact it had was very real. Carlos' roommate, Blake, continued his role as a leader in the movement, giving impassioned speeches and organizing events. Watching Blake in action made Carlos' anger burn deeper. How could someone who had been so indifferent to him suddenly be hailed as a hero for racial justice? And did Blake even care, or was it all for show? One afternoon, Carlos ran into Sarah at the library. She seemed nervous, constantly glancing around as they spoke. "Are you going to tell?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carlos shrugged, his mind heavy with indecision. "I don't know. What if exposing them makes things worse? What if people stop believing in the cause?" Sarah bit her lip, her eyes darting to the students nearby. "I feel guilty for not saying anything sooner, but if this comes out, people are going to be furious, not just at Blake and Kevin, but at all of us who knew." "Then why did you tell me?" Carlos asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's wrong," Sarah said firmly, "and I think deep down, you know it's wrong too." Carlos couldn't sleep that night. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. By the next morning, he had made his decision. It wasn't an easy one, but it was the only path that felt right. He called a meeting with the dean, Dr. Graves, and told him everything. From Blake's involvement, to Sarah's confession, to James admitting his role. Dr. Graves sat in stunned silence as Carlos recounted the details. "This is troubling, to say the least," Dr. Graves said, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. "Carlos, I appreciate your honesty, but you must understand the ramifications of what you're telling me. If this becomes public, it could damage the university's reputation, the progress we've made, and it could cause chaos among the student body." Carlos nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "But isn't it better to have the truth out there than to let this leak continue?" Dr. Graves sighed. "Sometimes the truth isn't as black and white as we'd like it to be, but you're right. This can't stay hidden forever." A week later, the truth came out. The university released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that there had been misinformation regarding the nature of the attack on James Wilkins. They didn't name names, but the fallout was immediate. Students were outraged, feeling betrayed by those who had claimed to lead them in the fight against racism. Blake and Kevin were quietly suspended, their reputations shattered. James faced scrutiny from the very people who had once rallied behind him, though many still sympathized with his cause. The protest died down, replaced by a sense of disillusionment and confusion. Carlos, meanwhile, found himself in an unexpected position. He had exposed the lie, but now he was seen by some as a traitor. To others, he was a hero for bringing the truth to light. He didn't know how to feel about any of it. Epilogue: Shadows We Carry. Months passed, and the chaos gradually settled. The university implemented new, more transparent policies for handling racial incidents, but the campus was quieter now. The fervor of the protests had faded, and many students seemed wary of trusting anyone's motives again. Carlos often thought about the night he had walked past the group of students whispering racist slurs. Those words had stung, but in some ways they were more honest than what had followed. The lies, the manipulation, the false promises of progress. Those were harder to swallow. In the end, Carlos realized that fighting against racism wasn't just about confronting the overt acts of hatred. It was also about navigating the complex and often murky waters of truth, intent, and manipulation. Sometimes even the people claiming to be allies could become part of the problem. But the fight wasn't over. Carlos had learned that change, real change, didn't come from lies or manipulation. It came from standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silenced, even when the truth was difficult. And as long as he was at Sandstone University, Carlos would continue to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been pushed to the margins. Because the shadows of racism ran deep, but the truth, no matter how painful, would always be the first step toward breaking free from them. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. For more gripping stories that challenge perspectives and make you think, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content, and we appreciate every single one of you for being part of this journey. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.